Welcome to the first edition of Mining Matters, our vlog focusing on the ins and outs of the developments in the mining industry, with some insights from our colleagues and friends on key trends, legal changes, and regulatory updates in the industry. My name is Nonku Zondo, and I'm an associate in the Energy Transactions and Projects team here at VNE.
And I'm Ciara Ross, and I focus on international dispute resolution here in London.
On our inaugural episode, we're very excited to welcome comments from Victoria Usova, General Counsel at Central Asia Metals, or CAML for short, and Kezia Owusu-Ansah, a Senior Associate at TEMPLARS in Ghana, focusing on critical minerals. Look out for our quickfire questions to them during this video. We're kicking off our vlog in the fall, and it has already been a very busy year for mining events. We've had PDAC, Mining Indaba in Cape Town, as well as the Financial Times Summit taking place in September here in London. VNE has also hosted a very lively series of events during the London International Disputes Week, which focused on energy transition and the race to net zero, particularly in relation to critical minerals. Ciara here attended a few of the events and can give us some insights on what key trends she's identified.
Yeah, what I saw throughout our London International Dispute Week event and at PDAC was a real focus on issues with the reputation in the mining industry. Of course, that's a legacy issue in mining. Public perception has always been, let's say, a little bit iffy. But in particular, something that was focused on at PDAC were in relation to reputation with ESG. And of course, that goes hand in hand for public perception. If you're doing well from an ESG perspective, then the public tend to be more on your side. But beyond the public perception, it's really the lender perception that was focused on at PDAC. And I think hopefully our listeners will find it quite interesting to hear about lenders' decisions to invest in mining projects and how re-rating has taken place in respect of mining projects in relation to ESG. And this isn't only going to have an impact on critical mineral mining, but also on more traditional mining as well. So in our vlog today, we're going to focus on these reputational issues and the role that ESG can play in helping to resolve some of these issues. But first, we're going to hear from Victoria Usova for our first round of quickfire questions.
That is a great question, and I have so many answers for it. But in short, I love the fact that the minerals and the raw materials that we extract and process are absolutely vital to modern living. I like all the teamwork that goes into starting a project and then completing it. So from start to finish, whether it's exploration, then exploitation, then permitting, building a mine, pilot studies, and then eventually commissioning into full production. It's really exciting, and it's multidisciplinary in terms of the kind of people you work with. Everyone from engineers to geologists to financing, accountants, banks. It's just a really interesting and all-encompassing industry to be working at this time. So I think one of the biggest challenges for the mining industry is definitely going to be around this race for critical minerals. This is extremely topical at this time. And given that a lot of the critical minerals are in jurisdictions that concentrated in jurisdictions that are either sanctioned or have different environmental standards, governance standards, human rights standards, getting access to those critical minerals and staying competitive in the race for this critical resource and a scarce resource is going to be a challenge for mining companies across the board. The thing I'm most excited about in terms of critical minerals is the changing landscape of mining and the positive attitude associated with mining, with governments promoting mining, especially of critical minerals, due to the realization that the raw materials we produce are not only essential for modern living, but also they're absolutely critical to decarbonization efforts and the green energy transition in the longer term. Personally, in terms of what I do in-house is the BD events and the search for the new BD opportunity, which will hopefully encompass in one way or another a critical mineral. I know that we currently invested in a company called Aberdeen Minerals, which is a Scottish exploration company. And they primarily are looking to explore for nickel, but there are also byproducts such as cobalt that come out of that as well. Nickel is currently on the watch list in the UK critical minerals list. I'm really excited about the opportunities that will come across my desk and the BD team's desk this year.
So as we kind of mentioned earlier, public perception of mining is quite poor. And some surveys have even placed it lower than oil and gas in terms of public perception for its reputation. And this is, of course, a legacy issue. It's something that the mining industry has had to grapple with for quite some time. And there's a lot of questions over how we resolve this, especially in view of the importance of the mining industry for moving towards net zero and the role of critical minerals, and also for the importance of all the other minerals and elements that we mine for, that we need in our day-to-day lives. So we need to think about ways to improve that and the different routes which mining companies can take to really prove to the public not only the importance of mining, but the shift in the approach towards a more sustainable future for mining. Oil and gas companies can and have really benefited from the race to net zero with the energy transition and being able to diversify their portfolios by focusing on renewables projects. And I think there are some lessons to be learned for the mining industry here as to how to really improve that reputation. And as we've seen, the oil and gas companies move above mining companies in terms of public perception. But before we kind of get into that, Nonku, why do we care so much about ESG?
And there's a number of reasons to care around ESG. I think given the importance of the mining sector to economies in general, this is a business for everyone, essentially. Every aspect of society is in some way, shape or form impacted, not only by the oil and gas industry or the energy industry, but by mining. And so it's something that everyone needs to care about. But in particular, where we're seeing the direction moving is really around accountability and holding mining companies and stakeholders who participate in the sector accountable to some of these targets and goals that each country, each industry member really has, set up for themselves. And where we're seeing the change as well as in financing and financiers, ESG issues, sustainability issues are really coming to the fore as a marker or an indicator for the bankability of a project and the bankability of a development. And with the shifting tide in critical minerals and the rise in demand and how quickly everything is changing to accommodate the race to net zero, there's a recognition that business can't be done as usual and that the legacy issues are things that would not necessarily be tolerated at the expense of trying to get to net zero. And so we're seeing sustainability really come up as a deciding factor as to whether or not a project is funded or supported by some of the traditional financiers. And I think another thing that really we should care about is that it also speaks to the management of risks. Sustainability issues really sit in that weird tripartite section of the world or of business, which involves really looking at both the environment, social impact, and the governance related to those industries and those companies and how they're run. And so we really care about these issues, and these issues should be of importance to everyone because of some of those considerations.
So I think all of those are such important points. Of course, we all understand the moral and environmental reasons behind needing sustainability and environmentally friendly mining. We need a greener planet to move towards net zero and to be able to realistically sustain the human race for the foreseeable future and not go into the next ice age. But I think from a risk management perspective, that really is not just a focus for the business, but is also going to be a focus for lenders. And that's something that I really look at a lot as a disputes lawyer, because far too often we come in when, unfortunately, everything has already gone wrong. And I know no one ever really wants to call a disputes lawyer. So some of the things that we consider will help avoid those disputes or lower the cost of them or just make businesses run more efficiently is in that early engagement. And that all comes in as part of the management of risk. So when I talk about early engagement, what do I mean? Well, it's early engagement with local communities who are going to be impacted by your mining project. And it's really important to build in your ESG targets in those discussions and to be able to ideally show a track record of maintaining those ESG targets in previous projects. Or if it's a novel technology or it's a new area you haven't worked in, or if you're a junior mining company and this is your first mining project, then showing how you are going to keep the local communities appraised of those topics, of those targets, is going to really improve your relationship with them. And more importantly than that is sticking to those communication goals. Now, we've all set targets before, personal lives, work lives, and not met them. It's impossible to meet every single target that you set, but you need to be able to explain why those targets weren't met. And having that constant communication is so important to demonstrating that you've met those targets. And that, of course, is not just important for local communities, but also going to be really important for your lenders. And they will see a lowering of risk in you having those targets and communicating them to the lenders, but also in your communication with local communities, because, again, you are lowering the risk of those disputes in the future. Another area where early engagement, I think, is really important is local government. Now, most likely you're going to get your mining license from the national government, from the Ministry of Mining, in whatever jurisdiction you're working in. But as we know, particularly in unstable regions where there are a lot of sort of rich minerals to mine, there can be a lot of political instability, and particularly at the high level. So you might see a lot of turnover at the top level of government, but you might see less turnover in local government. So having, again, that relationship with local government, engaging early, finding out who the key stakeholders are, is really going to demonstrate to your lenders and to the public that you really find it important to be communicative and to communicate those targets in relation to ESG to local government. And the other benefit that I think is really great of engaging early with local government is you get a little step up potentially in terms of regulations that are coming in, their considerations of what might be moving forward in terms of changing regulations. And that will allow you to be a step ahead, possibly consider the costs of those changes, how it's going to impact your project, and be a key stakeholder in guiding those regulations going forward as part of any consultation process. So I think that kind of management of risk really benefits every single person, because you're benefiting the local communities by giving them the chance to chip in and make sure they understand the project, make sure they're getting their concerns heard. You're also hearing those concerns and building them into your project, which lowers your chance of risk. And the same goes up through local government and, of course, your discussions with national government as well.
Speaking of regulatory changes, we're about to hear from Kezia Owusu-Ansah, a senior associate at TEMPLARS in Ghana, who will be sharing her experiences of the trends and developments in the critical mineral space in West Africa.
Well, I'm very excited that a lot of key players are now being introduced into the sector as countries are looking to boost their supply chain resilience in the critical mineral sector. We see a lot of countries diversifying from the normal players like China and Australia and looking finally to Africa. So that's a very interesting development for this year. Well, as more countries and more players are being introduced into the sector, more countries are now focused on developing a policy specifically for the critical minerals sector. So as lawyers, I see the biggest challenge being that we have to guide clients on how to navigate that shift in dynamics and how it cascades into effects on employment, on regulatory compliance and stuff like that. When you're inviting a mining client, you realize there's a lot of interplay between corporate governance, regulatory compliance, collective labor law, environmental issues. So that interplay and that dynamic between all these areas is a very daunting but very exciting task when advising mining clients.
Thank you, Kezia, for those insights on critical minerals developments in Ghana. We're particularly excited about some of them, largely because of how they fit in with all the work that we've been doing on critical minerals lately. The demand for critical minerals is growing rapidly, driven largely by the rise of clean energy technologies and electric vehicles. However, supply chains for some of these minerals remains highly concentrated, which has raised concerns about the supply security as well as some geopolitical risks. In response to some of these challenges, countries are working to boost their domestic supply and domestic production and capabilities. In response, countries are working rapidly to boost production and domestic supply capabilities, as well as diversify their supply chains through partnerships.
One jurisdiction where I've seen a real push towards more partnerships across jurisdiction is in the EU, and not just within the EU, but strategic partnerships have been entered into with a number of other jurisdictions. So, for example, in May this year, they entered into an MOU with Australia. As we all know, Australia is a hugely mineral-rich country. It was the top producer of lithium in 2022 and also produces quite a few other critical minerals. And Australia, of course, has this huge capacity to produce and needs support to boost its domestic supply. But also the EU is less mineral-rich and therefore has a real reliance on imported critical minerals. So having this strategic partnership with Australia gives it that boost of working with someone that's critical mineral rich and also boosting its own critical mineral supply. The EU also entered into a recent MOU with Serbia, and that was in mid-July of this year. And again, that focuses on critical minerals and specifically on batteries. And my understanding is that a lot of this is around a lithium mine in Serbia that could produce up to 20% of the EU's required amount of lithium, which is really a huge amount to get from one other country. And particularly if you counterbalance it against Australia, which is, of course, much further away. Yeah. So if you do have supply chain issues in terms of shipping or land shipping, any of those things, then you're not going to have quite such a problem from Serbia because it's so much closer to the rest of the EU, of course. So that's a really strategic partnership to enter into. There was a lot of pushback against the Serbian mining project for lithium, and licenses were revoked in 2022. So actually, this is a really quick turnaround and can show how ESG can potentially be used to change public perception. Whether public perception remains changed remains to be seen, because we don't know how the public in Serbia are going to react to this new critical minerals partnership and whether they will be accepting of the MOU and supportive, or whether we'll see quite a lot of pushback in terms of political demonstrations as we saw back in 2022. But it's a really exciting change and a really exciting development for the EU. And they've entered into quite a number of these MOUs with Uzbekistan, with Canada, with Australia, and with a number of other regions over the last few years. So over the next 6 months, we'll look out for how the strategic roadmap plays out both with Serbia and with Australia, and what we see in terms of real-time developments. One of the elements that I'm really excited about that's built into these strategic partnerships is around education, because that's something I think really plays into this mining reputational risk, is educating everyone on the importance of critical minerals, how they're used, how they're mined, and how the process will be greener in terms of mining, not just for critical minerals, but for other minerals and other metals that we mine for across the world. And I think that kind of educational aspect will really help build public perception, as well as the link between renewable energy and critical minerals. Education is something that we touched on at our event at VNE in June, and was something that was really highlighted. I had 5 or 6 people come up to me and say, I am so glad that you had that session explaining what critical minerals are and how they're used, because it's not something I necessarily understood. These were sort of quite junior audience members, but again, that reflects the sort of lack of public knowledge around what critical minerals are. And I think that increasing that education through these strategic partnerships with so many jurisdictions is really going to help improve the public perception of mining. And then through that, we can move it out of just a critical mineral space and move it into the space of how mining in general can become greener and has become greener over time?
Well, so ultimately, what I'm seeing is that the entire process is around reestablishing trust between the public and all the stakeholders who are involved in the industry, and almost unifying them towards a shared goal and a common interest. And so what we're seeing from some of these developments and the things that we've discussed today is really that the mining sector is faced with the challenge of both scaling up the industry while still maintaining sustainability principles and building towards responsible mining. Some of the partnerships that you've touched on, some of the stumbling blocks that they've hit were really ESG-centric type stumbling blocks or considerations that really touched on the importance of the sector to everyone in general. In addition to some of the partnerships, one of the other things that we're seeing as a key driver for development and improvement of the industry is really the investment in technology, investment in creating greener processes and using technology to drive that, whether that's through automation and AI, and then even interesting considerations around the cyclical or circular economy, as they say, which will involve, recycling and the reuse of minerals and consulting with stakeholders across the board to find out how best to use the minerals that we already have in circulation. And some of those partnerships are really opening the gateway for some of those conversations and reestablishing relationships and international ties that previously wouldn't have had access to because some of these minerals are so heavily concentrated in key regions. But now there's a platform and a space for new players to enter the sector. And even within the mining supply chain itself, there's pressure to go even greener and invest in renewable technology within the process of mining as well. And so implementing a combination of these strategies, we think that mining companies can really work towards meeting the growing demand while still maintaining a really big focus on sustainability.
So with the movement towards the use of a lot of new technologies, including AI, we're also seeing, again, this regulatory risk that is another one of those huge risk elements for our contractors and our mining players, because AI in itself and other new technologies all require new regulations. And that's on top of your ESG regulations, on top of your financial regulations, on top of your water regulations, on top of everything else you're considering as a mining contractor. So as much as the new technology is fantastic in making mining more efficient and giving us better sort of reporting for ESG targets as well, it also creates, again, another element of regulation that you need to be on top of. And that, again, really feeds back into my earlier kind of comment on early engagement and having those discussions with your local authorities, your local governments, and keeping an eye on these changes. But what I also hope to see is these strategic partnerships, such as the ones that the EU has been entering into, focusing on those new technologies and how those regulations are going to intertwine with the regulations they set up for base standards, for environmental requirements, for social requirements, for engagement requirements, so that we have a bit more of a uniform approach. And that's where the EU can, potentially be a leader here, because it's entering into these MOUs with so many other jurisdictions and will have potentially this influence on how the regulatory baseline is set, not just for critical minerals, but for mining across the board. And I personally am really excited to see potentially a more solid baseline of how regulations are brought in and what mining companies need to meet and hopefully exceed in relation to ESG requirements. And I think that's something that some of our GCs will be very excited about in mining companies across the board. As we know, regulatory changes are really something that does impact how companies are run. So having that early engagement, but also having some stability from governments is really going to help, because it can't all be on the mining companies. We need the governments to do their bit as well and be really communicating these changes and trying to have some sort of standardized baseline for mining companies to meet. So as you could see, a lot of our episode today was about trust, and I trust that you found today quite an insightful episode of Mining Matters, and we really hope that you'll join us for the next one. In the meantime, please do follow V&E on our LinkedIn page for future updates and sign up to our mailing list, which is linked below.